Hey everyone, we're going to be testing this today, which is the NVIDIA 7200GS. Now, we had a lot of problems with this graphics card, and if you'd like to find out why we're never even going to bother testing a card this old again, stay tuned until after the intro. Launching in 2006, the 7200GS is based on NVIDIA's Curie architecture and featured 112 million transistors, built on a 90nm fabrication process. This particular model, which is the gigabyte version of the card, featured 256MB of DDR2 memory on a 64-bit wide bus. The core ran at 450MHz, with the DDR2 memory running at 400MHz or 800MHz effectively. The codenamed G72 GPU featured 4 texture mapping units, 2 raster operations pipelines, or ROPs as you might see them listed elsewhere, 2 vertex shaders and 2 pixel shaders as well. No recent games will be playable here, not that anyone to computing would expect them to be, due to the 7200 only supporting up to DirectX 9. Now before we get on to the benchmarks, as mentioned before the intro, we had a lot of problems when testing the 7200GS. The main problem we had, at least when testing at stop clocks anyway, because with an overclock, this issue never surfaced at all. At stop clocks, the 7200GS was causing a lot of blue screen errors. And these always seem to be because of a page fault error, which would normally indicate a problem with the RAM of the PC. But because we know that RAM is stable, I mean, we've used it for long enough to know that it's stable, we know that it's the graphics card that is causing the problem. So yeah, that actually seemed to sort itself with an overclock though, for some reason, because when overclocked, there were no blue screens. Speaking of overclocking though, that brings us on to the second issue we were having with the 7200GS. Now, from what we've read online, you can quite easily overclock the memory on this card, but for whatever reason, no matter what we did, we could not overclock the memory on this card. Not even a single megahertz, we could not do it at all. No program was working, not even older versions of RibbitTuner like people used to use. We did actually manage to come up with a way to sort that, but we're going to save that for another video, so stay tuned until later on, and we'll talk a little bit about what we're actually going to be doing to overclock the memory. But for now, let's go on for the benchmarks. Starting off with Skyrim, we thought the 7200 would stand a good chance of being playable here, given how old the game is now. This is the original version and not the remastered one, and we're also using the lowest settings possible at 640 by 480. The performance was awful, and by awful we mean completely and utterly unplayable, to the point we actually gave up on the benchmark partway through. The input lag was severe, and was the worst we've ever seen when inside the Riverwood Trader. There was major texture popping, and controlling the character was near impossible in places. No benchmark means no FPS chart either. We did try overclocking though, which was problematic too, as like we mentioned, no matter what we did, we couldn't overclock the memory. And given how bandwidth restricted memory like this is, performance doesn't improve much when overclocking the core. We managed a 625MHz core clock however, but performance was just as bad and still nowhere near playable. GTA San Andreas performed fantastically, which was sort of expected given that the game came out in 2004. It still needed the res dropped to 800 by 600 with the lowest settings to get the performance you're seeing here though. There were no issues throughout whatsoever. The FPS never dropped below 60 and was usually upwards of 70 FPS. We also tried 720p as well, which also performed reasonably well, maintaining at least 30 FPS throughout, with only one occasion where it dropped below that. It is noticeably not as smooth as the lower res, as you would expect, but it does remain playable. Stock clocks managed 85, 40 and 32 FPS, average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, at 800 by 600. With 720 managing 38, 16 and 14 FPS for its average, 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, showing that there is at some points some stuttering, as shown by the 1% and 0.1% low figures. The 7200 managed 608MHz stable on the core, and given that we can't overclock the memory, the overclock could only push up the figures a little bit at both resolutions. The small difference would be more noticeable at 720p though, given how low the 1% and 0.1% low frame rates are. Portal is up next, which doesn't perform particularly well, even at 640 by 480 with the lowest settings. 800 by 600 was also benchmarked as well, but you can expect the issues 640 by 480 has to be more severe with a higher res. The game could run relatively smooth at points, however performance dips quite noticeably when looking at a Portal for example, which is kind of an important thing in this game. The FPS drops quite noticeably, and there is very noticeable input lag when it happens. There is actually noticeable input lag throughout, but it's at its worst when looking at the Portals, and when exiting the levels as well. 800 by 600, as mentioned, has basically the same problems but more severe. Both however are playable but won't be comfortable, 800 by 600 especially. You can ignore the 1% and 0.1% low figures here, as these are affected by the game effectively freezing entirely when loading between levels. That's not the 7200's fault though, that's just what the game does. 640 by 480 manages a seemingly respectable 32 FPS average, but the issues mentioned paint an entirely different picture. It managed 625MHz stable on the core, or at least we think it did because Benchy forgot to write down what it managed, didn't he? The overclock shows Portal to be not particularly dependent on memory bandwidth, as it shows an improvement outside of what would be expectable for variance between test runs, with improvements of 21.88, 33.33 and 36.36% for average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively, at 39, 20 and 15 FPS. The problems however remain. They're not as severe as at stock mind you, with the game actually seeming quite smooth at times. The game is actually reasonably enjoyable in this state. 800 by 600 also showed a relatively decent improvement in benchmark figures, however performance was still noticeably quite poor at times. The game is still playable to an extent, but isn't always comfortable, and certainly not like 640 by 480 is. And lastly, onto Crysis, a game which we weren't even going to bother benchmarking at first, due to how notorious it was for poor performance on lower end hardware. But we checked it out for a laugh and were amazed that it even ran, let alone was actually playable. Well, sort of. We ran it at 640 by 480 on the lowest settings. The game ran relatively well compared to expectations, with FPS hitting around 10 to 15 throughout, although it can dip into single figures when in dense forest areas. There was minor input lag throughout, with it being worse when in dense trees. Frame times were pretty inconsistent throughout, which adds micro stuttering to the already poor performance FPS wise. That said though, if this is all you can manage, it is still playable to an extent. 640 by 480 managed 13, 8 and 7 FPS for average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. With the 608MHz overclock, the max stable core clock we could manage, pushing these figures up slightly to 16, 10 and 8 FPS. A small improvement, but it does manage to lessen the input lag we noticed throughout the game. It's still noticeable in the dense forest areas, but anywhere else it's noticeably better.
So to conclude, the 7200GS was, in a way, it was absolutely awful, as you saw in the likes of Skyrim, Crysis with the performance it had in that, and Portal as well. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas performed great though, but in another way it was also a lot more surprising than we were expecting. Because speaking of Crysis, despite the terrible performance, the fact that it even launched Crysis, and the fact that it was even playable, and by playable we mean playable, because it's not comfortable but you can still do stuff. But the fact that we could actually even launch Crysis and still do stuff in the game was amazing. But yeah, with overclocking though, as we mentioned earlier, we had a lot of problems with that, namely with the memory of the 7200GS, because on our example of it, it couldn't be overclocked at all. And we did mention that we'd found a way to actually do that. So what we're going to be doing in the next video is going over the increased performance that you get from overclocking the memory on this. Now the way we actually overclocked the memory was to basically edit the BIOS. So in the BIOS of the card has like the stock core clock and memory clock that the card runs at. So all we did was just change that memory clock to whatever we wanted, reflashed the BIOS onto the card, and then Perfect.
Before we finish up today, we'd like to give shout-outs to Patreon supporters TazFaeDodge, ShadowInTheVoid and our newest patron Peter for helping to make all of this possible. So everyone, if you enjoyed the video, leave a comment and a like, and subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and don't forget to share the video as well. You can also support us in creating these videos through our Patreon at patreon.com/BenchyTests or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/BenchyTests. And remember, Ko-fi has a hyphen between the KO and the FI. But if you do decide to become a patron, you'll gain early access to all of our videos before the public do, for as long as you remain a patron. So thank you for watching. Hopefully we'll see you next time.